Welcome to DCF Investigations. There are stories that haunt the collective memory of a nation, tales so dark and unsettling that they fundamentally change the way we look at the world. Before 1977, the idea of sending a child to summer camp was synonymous with freedom, roasted marshmallows, and lifelong friendships. It was a rite of passage, a safe haven where the outside world could not intrude. But on one stormy night in the dense woods of Oklahoma, that innocence was shattered forever. Tonight, we are opening the file on the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders, a case that remains technically unsolved in the eyes of the law, yet burned into the history books as one of the most horrific crimes ever committed against children. We will walk the trails of Camp Scott, examine the forensic evidence that defined an era, and look into the eyes of the man accused of being a monster. This is a story of three little girls, a frantic manhunt, a controversial trial, and a mystery that lingers in the Ozark foothills nearly half a century later. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we must first transport ourselves back to the summer of 1977. It was a year of cultural transition. Star Wars had just premiered, capturing the imaginations of children everywhere. Jimmy Carter was in the White House, and Elvis Presley was playing his final concerts. The United States was moving away from the turmoil of the Vietnam era, and there was a renewed sense of hope, particularly in the heartland. Oklahoma in June is a place of heavy heat, thick humidity, and the constant hum of cicadas. In the northeastern corner of the state, near the town of Locust Grove, the landscape is dominated by the foothills of the Ozarks. It is a place of rugged beauty, with dense oak and hickory forests, deep ravines, and winding creeks. It is terrain that can hide a person for days or weeks or forever. Nestled within this thick foliage was Camp Scott. Owned by the Magic Empire Council of Girl Scouts, the camp was a sprawling 410 acres of nature designed to teach young girls independence and outdoor skills. It was supposed to be a sanctuary. In June 1977, preparations were underway for the first session of the summer. Counselors were training, tents were being pitched, and the excitement was palpable. However, unbeknownst to the happy campers packing their bags, a shadow had already fallen over Camp Scott. In the months leading up to the camp's opening, there had been warning signs on ominous precursors that were dismissed or underestimated at the time. During a training session for the counselors, someone had ransacked a cabin. They found donuts stolen and a disturbing message scrawled inside. But in the optimism of the season, these incidents were largely viewed as pranks or the work of local mischief makers, not the stalking of a predator. Among the hundreds of girls preparing for camp were three children who would become tragically linked forever. Lori Lee Farmer was only 8 years old. She was the youngest of the three, a bright and cheerful girl who had just finished the second grade. She had a precocious smile and a gentle spirit. Michele Heather Guse, aged 9, was a quiet, sweet-natured girl from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. She was known for her kindness and her love for animals. And then there was Denise Doris Milner, who was 10 years old. Denise was a lively, energetic girl who almost didn't go to camp that week. She had been on a waiting list and had only received her spot at the last minute. Her mother had hesitated, worried about her daughter being away, but eventually relented, not wanting to deny Denise the joy of the experience. These three girls, from different towns and different backgrounds, were assigned to the same unit. It was called the Kiowa Unit. The timeline of the tragedy begins on Sunday, June 12, 1977. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as buses loaded with excited girls arrived at Camp Scott. The chaotic joy of arrival, the hauling of duffel bags, and the assignment of tents filled the afternoon. The camp was divided into different units. They spread out through the woods to give each group a sense of privacy and connection with nature. The Kiowa Unit was located quite a distance from the main lodge, nestled deep in the trees. The tents were platform structures, canvas stretched over wooden frames with wooden floors. Lori, Michele, and Denise were assigned to Tent 8. It was the furthest tent from the counselor's cabin in the Kiowa Unit, sitting somewhat isolated at the edge of the trail. As the sun began to set on that Sunday evening, the weather took a turn. The heavy humidity of the Oklahoma summer broke into a violent thunderstorm. Rain battered the canvas tents, and thunder rolled through the valleys, shaking the wooden platforms. For many of the first-time campers, the storm was frightening, leading to homesickness and tears. The counselors of the Kiowa Unit did their best to comfort the girls, ensuring everyone was tucked in and safe. In Tent 8, Lori, Michele, and Denise settled into their sleeping bags. They likely whispered and giggled as the storm raged outside, bonding in the way that children do when placed in a new environment. Lori Farmer wrote a letter to her parents that night. In it, she wrote about her new friends and the excitement of being there. It was a letter that would not be read until her parents retrieved her belongings days later. A heartbreaking time capsule of her final hours. The storm provided the perfect cover. The noise of the rain and thunder would have masked the sound of footsteps on the forest floor. It would have drowned out the sound of a zipper opening or a stifled cry. Sometime during the darkest hours of the night or the very early morning of Monday, June 13th, a predator entered Tent 8. The events that transpired inside that tent are the stuff of nightmares, details that hardened detectives and devastated a community. The discovery came with the morning light. Around 6 a.m. on Monday, a camp counselor named Carla Wilhite woke up to start the day. The storm had passed, leaving the woods damp and misty. As she walked toward the shower house, she noticed something odd on the trail leading to Tent 8. It looked like a sleeping bag. Assuming one of the girls had dragged her bedding out during the night or that a prank had occurred, she walked closer. What she found stopped her heart. It was not just a sleeping bag. It was the bodies of the 3 girls. They had been removed from their tent and left on the trail. The counselor's screams pierced the morning silence, alerting the other staff members. The scene that awaited them was horrific. Lori Farmer and Michele Guse had been bludgeoned to death. Denise Milner had been strangled and bludgeoned. The brutality of the violence was shocking, suggesting a rage that went beyond simple, opportunistic crime. The camp director immediately moved to secure the area and protect the other children. In a testament to the staff's quick thinking, the surviving campers were gathered and moved to the dining hall, shielded from the grisly scene in the Kiowa Unit. Buses were called, and the evacuation of Camp Scott began immediately. Parents were notified to come and pick up their daughters, though they were not initially told the full extent of the horror. As news began to leak out, a wave of panic swept through the state. Law enforcement arrived at a scene that was rapidly becoming compromised. In 1977, crime scene preservation protocols were not as rigorous as they are today, and the remoteness of the location added to the difficulty. The initial response involved local deputies, followed by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, or OSBI. The woods were swarming with people, and in the chaos, valuable evidence may have been trampled. However, investigators managed to secure several critical items. Near the bodies and the tent, they found a red flashlight. On the lens of the flashlight was a fingerprint, a tiny smudge that would become the focal point of the entire investigation. They also found a roll of black duct tape, which had been used to bind the victims. Inside the tent, the scene was chaotic, but specific details stood out. A pair of broken glasses, the positioning of the girls' sleeping bags. The medical examiner's report was harrowing. The autopsies revealed that the girls had been killed with a blunt instrument, likely a flashlight or a similar heavy object. Sexual assault was confirmed, adding a layer of depravity to the murders. The DNA technology we rely on today did not exist. There was no CODIS database, no polymerase chain reaction testing to amplify minute samples. Investigators collected biological fluids, but in 1977, serology could only identify blood type and secretor status. They determined that the killer was a type AA-B secretor, a relatively rare classification that would help narrow the suspect pool, but could not definitively identify a single individual. As the shock wore off, the hunt for the killer began. It was the largest manhunt in Oklahoma history. The dense woods around Camp Scott were scoured by hundreds of officers, K-9 units, and volunteers. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors chopping the humid air. The search was difficult. The terrain was unforgiving, full of caves, sinkholes, and thick underbrush, where a person could hide indefinitely. From the very beginning, the investigation zeroed in on a local man named Leroy Hart. Hart was a 33-year-old Cherokee man who had grown up in the area. He was a fugitive, having escaped from the Mays County Jail 4 years earlier. Hart was not just a random suspect, though he had a history that made him fit the profile perfectly. He had been convicted of kidnapping and raping 2 pregnant women in 1966. He was known to be an outdoorsman, capable of surviving in the wild for extended periods. He knew the caves and the hollows of the Ozarks better than anyone. To the local law enforcement, Hart was the obvious suspect. He was a phantom, a man who could move through the woods without making a sound. The narrative around Leroy Hart became almost mythological. Local rumors swirled that he had mystical powers, that he was a shapeshifter or protected by bad medicine. Some locals, particularly within the Native American community, viewed him as a Robin Hood figure, a man persecuted by a white legal system. Others saw him as a boogeyman, a monster lurking in the shadows. The police found evidence that seemed to link Hart to the crime. In a cave not far from the camp, they discovered items that suggested someone had been living there. They found photographs that Hart had developed, newspapers, and food wrappers. Most damning of all, they believed the red flashlight found at the murder scene belonged to him. The manhunt for Hart dragged on for 10 months. It was a tense time for the residents of Locust Grove. People slept with loaded guns on their nightstands. Every shadow in the yard was a potential threat. The OSBI followed thousands of leads, interviewing anyone who had seen Hart or knew of his whereabouts. Finally, in April 1978, the break came. Acting on a tip, agents raided a small home in the Cookson Hills area, about 50 miles from the murder scene. A Leroy Hart was found hiding under the floorboards. He was taken into custody without a fight. The arrest of Leroy Hart brought a sense of relief. But it was only the beginning of the legal battle. The trial, which began in 1979, was a spectacle. It was held in defiance of the high emotions in the community, and the courtroom was packed every day. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Sid Wise, built their case on circumstantial evidence. They argued that Hart was in the area, that he had the skills to commit the crime, and that his history of violence against women established a pattern. They presented the sperm evidence, stating that the biological material found at the scene matched Hart's blood type and secretor status. They tried to link the flashlight and other items found at the scene directly to him. However, the defense team, led by a charismatic and tenacious attorney named Garvin Isaacs, launched a fierce counterattack. Isaacs argued that Hart was being framed. He pointed out the sloppy police work at the crime scene. He highlighted the fact that the fingerprint on the flashlight could not be definitively matched to Hart initially, and later analysis was fiercely debated. The defense painted a picture of a rush to judgment, suggesting that law enforcement was under immense pressure to solve the case and had pinned it on the most convenient scapegoat, the escaped convict and local outcast. One of the most compelling arguments for the defense was the physical discrepancies. They argued that the footprint found at the scene was too small to be Hart's. Maureen, they questioned how a man who had been living on the run in caves could have kept his clothes clean enough to enter the tent without leaving more debris. They also introduced the possibility of other suspects, individuals who had been seen in the area and who had violent tendencies but were ignored by police focused solely on Hart. The jury was sequestered, isolated from the growing media frenzy. After weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict that shocked the state of Oklahoma. Gene Leroy Hart was found not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The families of Lori, Michele, and Denise were devastated, feeling that justice had been snatched away. Hart was acquitted of the murders, but he was still an escaped convict with a massive amount of time left on his previous sentences. He was returned to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary to serve out the remainder of his 308 years for his prior crimes. The acquittal did not end the story. In fact, it only deepened the mystery and the pain. Less than 2 months after the verdict, Gene Leroy Hart collapsed in the prison exercise yard. He died of a massive heart attack on June 4th, 1979. He took whatever secrets he held to the grave. His death meant there would be no retrial, no further interrogation, and for many, no closure. In the decades that followed, the case of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders became a subject of intense scrutiny, speculation, and conspiracy. The not guilty verdict left a vacuum that was quickly filled with alternative theories. One prevalent theory was that Hart had not acted alone. Some believed he had an accomplice, plus perhaps another local man who helped him navigate the woods or served as a lookout. This theory attempted to bridge the gap between the evidence against Hart and the discrepancies pointed out by the defense. Another darker theory suggested a cover-up. Whispers circulated that the real killers were from prominent local families or were connected to the camp administration, and that Hart was a convenient patsy used to protect the powerful. These theories were fueled by the fact that the camp was quickly closed and eventually abandoned, and by the perceived inadequacies of the initial investigation. There were reports of 2 men seen walking near the caves shortly before the murders, men who were never identified or located. Were they the real killers? Or just hikers in the wrong place at the wrong time? Then there is the black magic angle. Given the cryptic note found during the earlier break-in and the strange arrangement of some items at the scene, some speculated that the murders were part of a ritual. This theory, while largely dismissed by serious investigators, added to the satanic panic narrative that would grip America in the coming decade. It spoke to the fear that something truly evil, something beyond simple human violence, resided in those woods. As forensic science advanced, so did the hope for a definitive answer. In 1989, more than a decade after the murders, the OSBI attempted to use early DNA testing on the evidence preserved from the scene. The results were inconclusive. The samples were old, degraded, and the technology was not yet sensitive enough to yield a clear profile. But the families did not give up, and they pushed for every new advancement in DNA technology to be applied to their daughter's case. In the early 2000s, and again in more recent years, further testing was conducted. These tests managed to generate partial DNA profiles. The results were tantalizing but frustrating. The partial profiles did not rule out Gene Leroy Hart, but they were not complete enough to prove his guilt with 100% certainty in a court of law. However, in 2022, a significant update was released. Sheriff Reed of Mays County, after reviewing all the evidence and the latest DNA analysis, released a statement. He declared that he was convinced, based on the totality of the investigation, that Gene Leroy Hart was indeed the killer. He stated that while the legal system had acquitted him, the investigative conclusion pointed solely to Hart. For the sheriff's department, the case was considered solved, even if the verdict said otherwise. However, for the families, this declaration brought mixed emotions. It was a validation of what the prosecution had argued 45 years earlier. But it could not undo the acquittal or the years of uncertainty. The families of Lori, Michele, and Denise have spent their lives fighting for their daughters. They have lobbied for victims' rights legislation, ensuring that other families would not have to endure the same isolation and lack of information they faced. They formed foundations and support groups, turning their grief into action. The legacy of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders extends far beyond the legal outcome. It changed the way parents in Oklahoma and across America viewed summer camps. Then the free-range childhood of the 1970s began to contract. Security at camps was tightened. Background checks became rigorous. The illusion of absolute safety in nature was gone. Camp Scott itself never recovered. It closed shortly after the murders and never reopened as a Girl Scout camp. Today, the land is privately owned. The trails where the girls once walked overgrown by the relentless encroachment of the forest. The platforms where the tents stood are rotting away, reclaimed by the earth. Let's take a moment to look deeper into the forensic challenges that plague this case to this day. When we talk about old DNA, we aren't just talking about a sample sitting in a tube. We are talking about biological material that was collected on cotton swabs or cut out of fabric in 1977. It has been subjected to freeze-thaw cycles, humidity, and the degradation of time. The enzymes that break down DNA are everywhere. Every time a sample is handled, a little more of the genetic code can be lost. When the 2022 testing was done, scientists were looking at fragments, tiny broken chains of genetic information. The fact that they could not exclude Hart is significant. In forensic science, failure to exclude means that the suspect's genetic markers are consistent with the evidence. If Hart had been innocent and the true killer had a different genetic profile, modern testing likely would have excluded Hart entirely. The fact that it didn't is the strongest scientific indicator we have that the man who died in prison was the man who walked into Tent 8. But we must also rigorously examine the defense's perspective, which still holds water for many legal scholars. Garvin Isaacs, the defense attorney, was not just using smoke and mirrors. He dismantled the state's timeline. He questioned the physical impossibility of certain actions attributed to Hart. If Hart was living in a cave, filthy and unkempt, how did he leave no mud, no leaves, no trace of the forest floor inside the tent? The only foreign debris found was related to the crime itself. This suggests a perpetrator who was perhaps more organized or cleaner than a fugitive living in the wild. This is where the conspiracy theories find their foothold. Was the killer someone who had access to a shower? Someone who could blend in? We also have to consider the psychological profile. Gene Leroy Hart was a rapist and a burglar. His crimes were violent, yes, but the murder of 3 children is a distinct escalation. Criminologists debate whether his profile fits that of a child killer. However, the counter-argument is that Hart was a desperate man, fueled by rage against a society that hunted him. And the opportunity presented by the isolated tent was simply too great for his predatory nature to resist. The community of Locust Grove still bears the scars of this crime. For the older generation, it is a memory that never fades. You can go into a diner in Mays County today, and if you bring up the summer of 1977, the mood will shift. Everyone has a story. Everyone remembers where they were when they heard the news. The division between those who believe Hart was guilty and those who believe he was framed still exists, though the sheriff's recent proclamation has settled the official record. The tragedy of the Girl Scout murders is not just about the loss of life, but the loss of trust. It was a collision between the innocent world of childhood and the darkest corners of human depravity. Lori Farmer, Michele Guse, and Denise Milner were just beginning their lives. Lori wanted to be a writer or an artist. Michele loved animals and wanted to help them. Denise had a vibrant energy that could have taken her anywhere. They were robbed of their futures in a way that is almost impossible to comprehend. As we analyze the current status, we are left with a legal cold case, but an investigative resolution. The authorities are satisfied that Hart was the killer. But because he was acquitted and is now dead, there is no final gavel, no sentence handed down for these specific murders. The case sits in a unique limbo, solved by detectives, unsolved by the courts. This brings us to the uncomfortable reality of true crime. Sometimes there is no perfect ending. Sometimes the evidence is messy, the trial is flawed, and the suspect dies before the full truth can be wrung from them. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders forces us to confront the limitations of justice. It forces us to ask whether we can accept a probable truth when a proven truth is impossible. We have walked the timeline, examined the evidence, and profiled the suspect. We have looked at the devastating impact on the families and the enduring mystery that surrounds Camp Scott. The rustling leaves of the Oklahoma woods keep their secrets well. But the memory of Lori, Michele, and Denise ensures that the silence is never absolute. Their names are spoken, their stories are told, and their lives are remembered. This has been a deep dive into one of America's most haunting, unsolved mysteries here on DCF Investigations. We strive to bring you not just the headlines, but the exhaustive details that paint the full picture of these tragedies. We want to know what you think. Do you believe the recent DNA findings and the sheriff's conclusion that Jean Leroy Hart was the sole perpetrator? Or do you believe, as the defense argued in 1979, that the real killer or killers might have slipped away into the darkness, leaving Hart to take the blame? It is a question that has divided Oklahoma for nearly 50 years. Leave your thoughts, your theories, and your analysis in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay observant, stay safe, and keep seeking the truth.